All from your seats, that's what we started. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, scholars, professors, and students. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Zhang Xing. I'm a lecturer of South Asian Studies at Peking University. It is really my honor to have invited Professor Victor Mair to give the lecture today on Sinology. I have been knowing about Professor Mair's work for a long time, and also during the past few years, I got a chance to meet him in person on various occasions in different parts of the world, and he was also very helpful and also gave me lots of insightful suggestions in the comments when I was writing my dissertation in Germany. So this time when we were planning out this lecture on Sinology, I immediately thought about him, and I really appreciate that he agreed to do so given his very busy schedule here in China. As some of you perhaps already noticed, this lecture belongs to the lecture series of our research project called Research Methodologies on Eastern Studies that we currently started. So before we formally start the lecture today, I would like to invite Professor Liu Shuxiong, the advising professor of this research project, as well as the professor of South Asian Studies here in Peking University, and also my advisor when I was doing my PhD here, to say a few words about this research project and also how today's lecture is going to contribute to it. So let's welcome Professor Liu.
Thank you. Respected Professor Dr. Victor Mair, respected guests and colleagues, dear students, today it is a great pleasure and honor for us to invite Dr. Victor Mair to our workshop, Eastern Studies Workshop, School of Foreign Languages at Peking University. Dr. Victor Mair is a professor from the University of Pennsylvania, the United States. He is a famous sinologist and a Western scholar of Eastern Studies. His talk of this afternoon, Methods and Aims on Sinology Then and Now, is 100% coherence with our project research methodologies in Eastern studies. I believe that it will surely benefit and inspire us a great deal with our studies. The project of ours is supported by Give to Asia, the United States, and donated by Dr. Zheng Xianzhang's family. This project pays close attention to the accomplishments of Chinese scholars in the studies of Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Arab Islamic, and the ancient Near Eastern cultures, analyzing and highlighting the methodological frameworks that the Chinese scholars relied on and created in the research of the above-mentioned fields. It aims at exploring the methodological characteristics in the research of Eastern studies by both the Eastern and the Western scholars, thus strengthening the international academic exchanges in the relevant field. We are very grateful to Dr. Victor Mair for his coming to our school, and we are now earnestly looking forward to his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu. I'm sure that all of you are waiting for Professor Mair to give the lecture, but before that, let me say a few words about you. So, anyway, I have to do the introduction. So, I think as most of you already got to know, Professor Mair is a professor of Chinese language and literature at the University of Pennsylvania, just as Professor Liu also mentioned, where he has been teaching since 1979. And he holds degrees from Dartmouth College, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and Harvard University. So, trained in Indo-European languages such as Sanskrit and Hindi and other Eastern Asian languages, and also, of course, also Chinese. He first focused on Chinese classical literature, including philosophy and religion, and turning his attention to Chinese popular literature, which had been altogether shunned by both Chinese and Western scholars. He opened an entirely new vista on neglected mainstreams of non-standard writings and their contingency with artistic productions. Professor Mair is also an editor of more than 24 books, and also he's the editor of Sino Platonic papers, and is on the editorial boards of several other sinological journals. So now let's welcome Professor Mair to give that lecture.
I think I'll stand up because I like to move around. Well, do I need amplification? Can everybody see me? Okay, can you all hear me?
Do you have to stand at the podium? Can you stand at this table here?
Well, I could sit down, but I like to move around. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. We're all ready to go. First of all, thank you all for coming. It's an honor to have so many people come to hear me talk about Sinology, especially a lot of old friends from far places and new friends from near places. My host requests that I speak in both Chinese and English. Now, I'm not going to do a simultaneous translation for myself, but I will use Chinese when it's appropriate and English when it's appropriate. 有的是插一点中文，有的是用英文，要看什么时候合适，随便。I don't know how I'll do it, but I'll do it. You'll hear some English and you'll hear some Chinese, and I hope it all makes sense. And thanks also to this workshop for inviting me to come and give this talk. Now, when I wrote my first book for a commercial press, that was the Dao De Jing for Bantam, which is a very different thing from writing for an academic press. Because when you write for an academic press, you're writing for scholars. And when you write for a commercial press, you're writing for a very large audience. And you're supposed to sell books. So they asked me, after I finished the book, they said, tell us who you are, to give us a little self-introduction. I said, I'm Victor H. Mair, I'm a sinologist. And they said, stop. You can't be a sinologist. Nobody will know what that means. 谁都看不听不懂什么是 sinologist. So I said, okay, I'm a philologist who emphasizes China. So that's what my definition of a sinologist is. A philologist who focuses on China. And they said, stop right there. Nobody will know what a philologist is. So then I said, well, that's what I am. I'm a philologist who focuses on China. I'm a sinologist. That's my career. That's my profession. And I'm very proud of it. Sorry, they said, you have to be, well, why don't you call yourself a linguist? And I said, well, I'm not a linguist. Even if you think so, there's a big difference between a linguist and a philologist and a sinologist. So I've been struggling with this, trying to educate people about what sinology is and what a sinologist is, ever since the beginning of when I became one. And I still am happy to be a sinologist, and I want to be one until the day I die and become a mummy in Central Asia. I've decided I'm going to die in Central Asia and become a mummy. So I should be a sinologist until the very last minute of my existence on this earth. So this whole year, I've been on sabbatical from Penn. 我整年休假。第一个学期在清华大学教书，第二个学期在北大教书。邀请单位两个地方都是在白板写的。The first one is 北京大学国际汉学家研究基地。That's quite a mouthful. And it's also I'm sure whoever chose it very, very carefully. And I'm told that it was 教育部 who chose it, not 北大的教授们. Because it's a very interesting name. And I will talk about it in a little bit. And then the first semester when I was at Tsinghua, it was 清华大学国学研究院 who invited me to come and talk. And I will discuss both the Chinese names and the English names of these places. And then we have 复旦大学文史研究院, National Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies. And there's also 昨天我在中国人民大学讲，也是在他们的人民大学的国学院。So all these premier universities in China are setting up these institutes for sinological studies and an institute for advanced studies. And they're all choosing slightly different names, but they're all hovering around sinology. And some of them say sinology directly, and some of them avoid the word sinology. Some of them use the expression 国学, and some use the expression 汉学. So we have 国学 and 汉学, and I'm going to talk a lot about the difference between 国学 and 汉学. And then before I start to talk in detail about these different names in Chinese, I want to talk about the different English names. So we have, please pay attention, I think everybody in the room knows both Chinese and English, and that your degree, your level in both of these languages is very advanced. So you should be able to tell very easily that the English and the Chinese do not match. It's very clear that the English is chosen to speak to foreigners. trying to say, like, what are we in English? Whereas the Chinese name is for the consumption of Chinese. So they're not always saying the same thing. So we have for Beijing 大学国际汉学家研究基地. See, like 汉学家, I am a 汉学家. Thank you. I'm a sinologist. And that's the best way to say it in Chinese. But, okay, so it's a GD, which is a base. Al-Qaeda. It's a very, very unusual name. And not only is it Al-Qaeda, it is also 研修基地. I am here to 研修. 研修. I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm doing it. I'm doing my best to 研修. And what is 研修? Well, it's probably a shortened form of 研究进修吧. Probably, which means training, research and training. But am I being trained or am I training someone? I'm not sure. I don't know. And I've been here for a long time, but I'm still wondering what this word 研修 means in reference to Victor Mair. Maybe during the question and answer period we can get some enlightenment on that. I will speak for about an hour and a half or an hour and 20 minutes, and then I'll open the floor to questions, because it may be half an hour, 20 minutes, because I want to have some dialogue with you. Okay, so that's GD. And then Tsinghua is the Tsinghua, and you notice it's Tsinghua, it's not Tsinghua, it is Tsinghua. And there's a historical reason for that, of course. And also it's not Peking, it's not Beijing University, it is Peking University. And both Beida and Tsinghua are very adamant and proud of the fact that they are Peking University and Tsinghua and not Beijing University and Tsinghua. There's tradition there. And the tradition is both Western and Eastern. It's all wrapped up together. So it's the Tsinghua Academy of Chinese Learning. Okay, now we get into some real meaty stuff. It's an academy. And actually, the GD is also an academy. It's not a base. In English, it's an academy. And the Guoshe Yanzhou at Tsinghua is also an academy. Why is it academy? You could say Yanzhou Yuan should be something like college, right? Or school in current parlance. But the people who translated these names into English have chosen the word academy, and I'm sure they chose it very, very carefully. And why did they choose the word academy? Because they want to evoke Shuyuan. They want to evoke this old Chinese, like Neo-Confucian academy of the Song. And Song through Qing, we had all these academies, Confucian academies. So actually the English is more traditional than the Chinese. It's saying academy and saying Tsinghua and saying Peking University. So the English is more, what can I say, Orientalist? Or it's a little bit more old-fashioned than the Chinese. Not a little bit, a lot of it. Quite a lot. So now we move on to Fudan Dashi Wenshi Yanzhou Yuan. And here we have, for one thing, they don't say Fudan, they say national. I don't know if everybody else is so happy about that. I mean, like, why is Fudan national and Beida isn't national? I don't know. So this is something that you have to think about. Why don't they say Fudan University? And they don't even say Guoshe or Hanxue, because, as you will see in a moment, both Guoshe and Hanxue are problematic. They're not simple terms that you can just plug in to Putonghua. They have some kind of very convoluted historical background, which I will get into. So they avoid Guoxue and Hanxue by saying Wenshi, which is really humanistic in purely Chinese terms, literature and history. So it's like humanistic. And then we have 中国人民大学国学院, which is like Tsinghua, which is a 国学, but they're 国学研究院. So, now what I need to talk a lot about Hanxue and Guoxue and exactly what kind of words they are and how they came into Chinese and when they came into Chinese and what they mean in Chinese. Because, let's face it, I present myself to you as a Hanxue Jia, and that's the best way to refer to me in Chinese, Hanxue Jia, if I merit that. Because I say that in English I'm a sinologist, and what I do is sinology. So, it just so happens that both Hanxue and Guoxue are what I call 来回词, round-trip words. They both started out in Old Chinese, in the Han Dynasty, or even maybe a little bit earlier, the Han Dynasty, referring to something other than sinology for sure. Now, we'll have to go into the history of the words Hanxue and Guoxue. It's very interesting that the word sinology in English is actually much later than I thought it was. It's not until about 1882 that we have the word sinology in English. And I think around the same time we get Indology, 1888. So these are much later than I thought. I thought that sinology would go way back into the time of Matteo Ricci, Li Mado. But actually you can say the roots of sinology go back to Matteo Ricci and Nicolas Rigaud, Jiniga, Li Mado, and the Jesuits who came and brought Western learning to China. And then the Western learning took root, like physics, cartography, geometry, so many different areas. Western learning took root in China, and it helped to develop 考证学, empirical, evidential learning in the Qing dynasty. But you see, 考证学 is not the same as Hanxue. So it took a while for this idea of sinology to come into existence, even the term sinology to come into existence. We have it in German, we have it in French, and we have it in English. But as a kind of profession or a discipline, it's not until the late 19th century that it arises. Now, in old Chinese texts, what does Hanxue mean? We have, it means something very different in old Chinese text and in modern Chinese text. So in old Chinese text, Hanxue was basically like Xungu Xue applied to the classics, the Confucian classics. It was very specific kind of learning. You could say Han learning, but that's very different from sinology. And then Guoxue, which is the other term that's often evoked in these institutes, it originally meant a school. It meant a 学校. Guoxue was a school. It wasn't a kind of learning. So you would enter a Guoxue, or you would study in a Guoxue in the Han period. And then it wasn't until the 20th century that Guoxue started to mean like national learning or national studies. And how it got to mean that involves a trip to Japan, which I'll tell you about a little bit more. And how Hanxue got to mean Sinology also involved a trip to Japan and then getting sent back. So both Guoxue and Hanxue in the 20th century started to mean this kind of national learning or sinology. And the people who sort of introduced it into Chinese parlance, modern Mandarin, are people like Lu Xun, who went to Japan. So they were the ones who started to talk about Guoxue and Hanxue, referring to comprehensive, broad studies of traditional China, which it's very different from the old idea of Guoxue and Hanxue. And in these names of these institutes, it's the modern meaning we're talking about. So then, Hanxue, I also want to say that it specifically refers to foreigners who study traditional China. In the Hanyu Da Cidian, it says, 外国人研究中国的学文的汉学。为汉学. So it says foreigners who study traditional Chinese learning, that's Hanxue. It doesn't say Chinese do it, it's what the foreigners do. So it's very clear that Hanxue is intended, or was intended when it was first coined, to refer to this Sinology or Sinology or Sinology, what the foreigners do to study old China. And then for Mao Zedong also had a way to thinking about Hanxue, and for him it was like a modern academy. He called it a Sishu. So in his report on Hunan People's Movement, he says that the people studying in Hanxue. So Hanxue and for Mao Zedong became something like Guoxue in the old times, a place to go study. It was like a school. Okay, so we know pretty much where and when Hanxue, what it meant originally and when it started to mean comprehensive studies of traditional China. But Guoxue is a little more complicated because it gets involved with the Japanese notion of kokugaku. And kokugaku goes back to the late 17th century and the early 18th century. And in English it's sometimes referred to as nativist or nativist studies or native. And it was sort of like, okay, the Japanese also had kangaku. And when they did kangaku, traditionally, they were referring to old Xingu type xue in old China. They were trying to be really good Confucian scholars when they did kangaku, Hanxue. But then a new generation of scholars in Japan, so like in opposition to kangaku, they came up with the idea of kokugaku. And they emphasized like wagaku, wagakuni, my country, which is Japan. It's not China. 我国, but 我国 in Japan means Japan. So they have this idea that kokugaku meant nativist Japanese studies that try to avoid Confucian implications and complications. So they try to go to texts like the Kojiki, which is the record of ancestral ancient matters, very old Japanese text, 712 for that one, and the Nihon Shoki, which is the Chronicles of Japan, 720, and the Manyoshu. Everybody knows the Manyoshu, the 10,000 Leaves, a collection of very old Japanese poetry. That's from the 8th century, late 8th century. So this was kokugaku for the Japanese. And the Chinese weren't really talking about kokugaku much, certainly not in that sense, because it would only make sense in the Japanese context. Okay, so then along comes this Western learning, this new approach to the study of traditional China, which is very different from the Chinese traditional approach to old China. So here comes Sinology, and the Japanese, as with so many other ideas and notions from the West, they said, well, we have to come up with a legitimate term for East Asians. And so it was the Japanese who wedded Guoxue, and especially Hanxue, to the Western word Sinology. And Guoxue, in 20th century Japanese, early 20th century Japanese, it referred to the same kind of idea of traditional Chinese learning. So it wasn't the old kokugaku from the 17th and 18th centuries. It now was this Western European learning, kokugaku. Guoxue. So the Chinese overseas students, Liu Xuesheng in Japan, they get this word Hanxue and they take it back to China with this new meaning of what it means as Sinology. And I think that's certainly the kind of meaning in terms of these institutes. It's not the old meaning. It's this new Europeanized meaning. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm pushing too hard on the idea of round-trip words, I'm going to rattle off a few now. They can all be documented very clearly. And it'll blow your mind, I think, when you realize that the modern intellectual history of China is very much dependent upon Japanese as a bridge to Europe. So, philosophy, 哲学, Tetsugaku. Philosophy in Old China did not mean, 哲学 in Old China did not mean philosophy. But it does in modern Chinese. Okay, 宗教. It means religion now in modern Chinese. But it certainly didn't mean religion in the Song Dynasty. And it comes from Japanese shukyo. The same two characters. So how about 文学, literature, 文学, 经济, economics. 经济 did not mean economics in the Song Dynasty. It meant administration in some like succor or something like that. Household administration. It didn't mean economy. So these words, there are hundreds and hundreds of these words in modern intellectual discourse that are what I call round-trip words. They start in China, they go to Japan, and then they get a new meaning attached to it, and they go back to China. And that's Hanxue and Guoxue are this kind of word. And I want to say one other, because many of the people in this room are 博士学位, or you are aspiring to be 博士. 博士 is one of these round-trip words. And it is very interesting. I wrote a whole long article about the evolution of the term 博士 from Han and even a little bit earlier than Han. And we know that it meant erudite, right? It meant a scholar who focused on the classics and was very learned in the Guoxuyan, in the academy. We call them erudites in English. 博士. But then it's very, very interesting that 博士 by the Tang Dynasty becomes like a master of some trade. You can say 茶博士, a tea waiter, which is very different from a Handite of 博士. And I'm going to talk about William Hong later in this lecture. Hong Ye. I will have a lot to say about him. And I took classes with him at Harvard. And one time, a Chinese lady who was sitting in on his class, she was a very polite lady, and she wanted to address him in a very respectful way. So he came in the room and she said, 洪博士你好. 他很生气. What? I'm not a 博士, 茶博士. I'm not. 我是洪教授. He didn't like to be called a 博士. So there, because of this tradition, this old tradition of 博士, it could even be like a cart driver, 赶车的, in the Yuan dynasty. And then it could even be a musician. It's sort of like we now say 老师, 师傅, can be anything, right? These words are very transformational, especially when they have to do with the master. We all know how 同志 has gotten changed around. These are very flexible terms, and they usually go down the scale to lower and lower levels. And so that's what happened to 博士. But then 博士 got elevated in the 20th century because the Japanese said, we need a word for PhD. And we have this hakase or hakushi. So 博士 got rescued and refurbished. And so now it's very honorable to be called a 博士, but it still has that heritage of the medieval period when it meant something low, from Tang through Yuan, and even on beyond the Yuan. Beyond that, 博士 was taken up by Turks and Persians, and it went all over Eurasia. It got into Hindi, Urdu, Bakshi. They call it Bakshi because of that you see in Japanese is Hakushi. You get the Ru Sheng Zi. So it was in Persian. It was in all the way to Ottoman Turkish. It was very common in Ottoman Turkish to refer to someone as Bakshi. And in the Indian army, because it was the Persians who were, I often talk about the Persians taking around cultural artifacts, cultural ideas. They're what I call the Kulturvermittler, the cultural brokers. The Persians, the Iranian peoples, the Sogdians, the Sassanians, they're the ones who run back and forth around the Silk Road. And in the Yuan dynasty, it was the Persian was like a lingua franca. So that's how 博士 got spread all over Eurasia. It started in the Han, and now there it is. So there are these 来回词, these round-trip words. And 国学 and 汉学 and 博士, these are good examples of words that got new meanings, very radically new meanings in Japan. Okay, so I'm going to start discussing Sinology more directly, what it is in the West. Another old teacher of mine at Harvard, Achilles Fang, used to read, or Fang Zhetong, he used to call it, and it'll be okay if I write this as well. He called it acidology. And he says, when we would take his classes, he would always say, you don't want to become an asinologist. Don't do it. Why do you want to read all those dirty books? He was always trying to discourage people from becoming hanxuejia. This is the guy who knew Ezra Pound so well and taught Ezra Pound much of what he knows about Chinese poetry. And he also is the man who knew Marianne Moore, and Marianne Moore called him a wizard with words. And his bathtub was full of books. And he had earlobes like the Buddha. Achilles Fang. So he was my teacher, but he always tried his best to prevent people from becoming an asinologist. Because he was actually trying to be kind to you, because to be a real sinologist, it is hard as hell. It's no simple thing. I mean, you have to be very, almost like masochistic to want to become hanxuejia. By the end of this talk, I hope you will agree with me. It's not for the feeble-minded or the weak of heart. It's for people who have a lot of strength and endurance. Well, one of my students one of my favorite PhD students refers to my profession as Sinology, and I don't like the sound of that. But it's actually a legitimate alternative pronunciation. Sinology, Sinology. It is a kind of sin to do it. Now, if you talk about who were sinologists, I mean, if you want some representative sinologists, then I would think of the winners of the Stanislas Julien Prize. Stanislas Julien was a great French sinologist, and it's awarded to the very best book it is published in a year, or group of books by an individual scholar. So the very first Stanislas Julien Prize was given to, it's not a surprise that he got it, in 1875, James Legge. Yay! James Legge deserved it. I mean, he translated all of the Chinese classics, the Confucian classics, and some other things as well. And his translations still stand up, even though they're Victorian. Really reliable. I mean, they're not in the English language of today, but they're still getting reprinted, and people still refer to him. So he's like an example of a sinologist, and the first winner of the Stanislas Julien Prize. But then you see the Stanislas Julien Prize. If you look it up on the web, and you'll see like the recent winners for the last 20 years or so. They're not in the mold of James Legge at all. So if that's the prize for sinology, like the Plum Prize for sinology, then sinology has changed radically. Because I know a very close friend of mine won the Stanislas Julien Prize. Her name is Elfriede Regina Knauer. She wrote a book called The Camel's Load in Life and Death. Rung Laoshi knows that book. And I think Wang Gongwei Jiaoshu also knows that book. She doesn't know a word of Chinese. Whenever she had a question about Chinese text, and she did often, she would come and ask me. She knew what questions to ask. And she asked intelligent questions, and I answered them. So, look, you can do sinology without knowing Chinese. Believe it or not. Whereas, I mean, now you can apparently. But when I began sinology, and still in my own mind, the kind of sinologist I want to be is someone who's a master of Old Chinese, who can read it very well, very rigorously, and can solve all sorts of problems relating to Old Chinese texts. Now, Keita Knauer cannot do that, nor can a lot of the people who have been winning the Stanislas Julien Prize. So you can see that sinology has been transformed, has changed. Because what is it now? It's sort of like, by whatever means, to be able to illuminate some aspects of old Chinese civilization or culture. And that doesn't necessarily imply mastery of the Chinese language, which it did originally, and which it did for me. Because for me, sinology was philology applied to China, and philology is definitely language-centered. The old model of a sinologist for me was exemplified by people like Edward Chavannes, Paul Pelliot, Berthold Laufer, Erwin von Sack, people like that. And I consider somebody like Pelliot to be almost a god. I mean, I really do sort of worship him. I do worship him, I'm sorry. Pelliot was unbelievable. All the languages he knew, and his gigantic mind and wisdom, and he could just cite things from all sorts of fields, Mongolian, Manchu, Persian, Tibetan, Annamite, whatever. He knew it. And that's why when he went to the Dunhuang caves and he read like a manuscript a minute, he picked the right ones. And Stein, when he went there, could not pick the manuscripts so intelligently. So there's a very famous picture of Paleo in the cave like this. You all know it, right? Huddled over a candle in the cave 17. And reading the Dunhuang manuscripts, and he could read them all. He could read Chinese extremely well, and he could read all the other languages too. So I dedicated my second book to Paul Paleo. My first book was dedicated to my father, and my second was dedicated to Paul Paleo, and I still think of him as a giant. And now, see why I worship these guys so much. They're the real Sinologists. Like, we are something else. We're struggling as best we can. But you see, they didn't have concordances and indices and computers. They didn't even have Morohashi. I mean, just think what we do with Morohashi. And now people have outgrown Morohashi. How many of you consult Morohashi daily? Well, it used to be when I was a graduate student, you were looking at Morohashi like every 10 seconds, day in and day out. And now we have Hanyu Da Cidian, which is really good, but not good enough. We need another edition, a new edition of Hanyu Da Cidian, but we didn't have, people like Paleo, they didn't have it. All they had was something like Pei Wen Yun Fu. And if you've played around with Pei Wen Yun Fu, you know it's hard to get information out of it. It's hard to get a definition out of it because there's no definitions. All it is a bunch of collection of sentences for rhyming purposes. It's a rhyme dictionary. Of course, it's that big. But that's what those guys really relied upon Pei Wen Yun Fu to figure out old texts. Think of it. How much easier our life is now. Well, I grew up, I'm an earlier generation than most everybody in this room in terms of Hanxue. My teachers really didn't learn Putonghua or Guoyu even. My teachers. Like somebody like Cleves, he was a real sinologist. He probably spoke Mandarin better than most of the professors at Harvard. But most of the professors at Harvard in the previous generation didn't speak, or in other universities too, they didn't speak Chinese, Mandarin. Like classical Chinese was a dead language and you don't need to speak it. So it was sort of like Greek learning and Latin learning and Sanskrit learning, old Sinology, Indology, Assyriology. Nobody's speaking Assyrian, right? Or Sumerology. Those are dead languages. And that's the way people looked upon classical Chinese, as a dead language. And there's no reason to learn Putonghua or Guoyu. Now that's all changed. Because I came right at the cusp of the change from those who spoke no Mandarin, or almost no Mandarin, and those who speak good Mandarin. Like all the people now, when they come to our universities, we expect them to have at least 6 years of Chinese, really good, when they come to study in graduate school. But when I went to graduate school, you could get into a Chinese program without knowing any Chinese practically, or just 1 year. So I was right on the border between when it was important to know Mandarin or when it was not important to know. So there's been that huge change. Of course, that's going to influence the way people look upon old Chinese things because they're now viewing them more and more through the lens of modern Chinese. And I have to say, there's often a problem in technical terminology in many fields, but let's just take art history. Because at Penn, we have a very active art history program, Chinese art history, and I get stuck. I'm on practically every dissertation in Chinese art history, and we have a lot of them. So I'm reading this stuff all the time, Chinese art history, and one problem that keeps coming up over and over again is that even these doctoral students, and it's not just at Penn, it's everywhere, they can't distinguish between modern technical vocabulary applied to ancient times and ancient technical vocabulary. It's a big muddle. And I often have to say, when I'm writing comments on their dissertations, I say, look, you're referring to this term as though it's reified. It's something that refers to something real in the Song or Tang or Nanbei or something. And such a term didn't even exist. This is a modern term. So this has become a problem because in the old days, people didn't worry about Mandarin. They didn't get mixed up with modern terminology. You see what I'm talking about? In the old days, it was just the old text, and that's all, and English. So those old scholars, they had, I'm trying to see, where's my watch? They didn't have Morohashi, they didn't have Hanyu Da Cidian, they didn't even have Cihai, for God's sake, or Ciyuan. Think about that. Ciyuan and Cihai only go back to about the 20s or 30s. They're new. I mean, the whole idea of a dictionary in Chinese is new. A word dictionary. I mean, of course, there were always zidian from Shuowenjie Zi. There were zidian. But it really wasn't until Cihai and Ciyuan that you have Cidian. That's why they call them Ci. But, there wasn't even a concept for word then. There was no concept for word in Chinese. So they had to invent a word for word. So that's a new term. And so the whole idea of a Cidian just didn't exist. Because there were no Ci until there was no concept of it Ci in Chinese until this word for word was invented. And I can tell you, from having taught at places like Hong Kong University, where there are a lot of bright students there, I taught 72 students, like Confucius, 72个学生, and they were the best, the cream of the crop of Hong Kong. And I spent a whole semester trying to tell them what a word is. It just didn't sink in. They couldn't 分不清字跟词多么不一样. They really couldn't get it. They thought Chinese only has 字, no 词. So, I mean, this is understandable because the whole idea of a word in Chinese is new. It's new. And that's why Ciyuan and Cihai, you think, how do you write the word Ci? The idea of Ci in Ciyuan and Cihai? Phrase. They wrote phrase. So actually, Ciyuan and Cihai are like the very beginnings of word dictionaries in China. And they're more like, in the minds of the people who made them, they're more like phrase dictionaries, if you know what I mean. Of course, Chinese had words all the way back before the Han. Definitely had words. But they weren't a unit of linguistic analysis. It wasn't part of Xiaoxue. Xiaoxue was just so dedicated minor learning as opposed to Daxue. Xiaoxue was dedicated to phonological and orthographical concerns. And that's all this zi-oriented. Zi. So people like Pelliot, these giants, these gods, they didn't have Cidian, but yet they had to analyze text according to as though there were Ci, and they had to have the minds that would extract Ci from text when there were no Cidian around to help them. So we can be grateful for the developments in the 20th century of Cihai, Ciyuan, and then Morohashi. And you have to remember, how great was Morohashi? He has to be almost like a god too for making the dictionary for us, Daikanwa Jiten. Because, you know, that dictionary was completed and then it was perished in the Tokyo fire bombings. He had to make that dictionary twice. And it's so gigantic. Of course, he had a team of people helping him. But, I mean, my generation was just so indebted to Morohashi and that kind of dictionary because it made our life so much easier than the people who had Cihai and Ciyuan or the people who had only Peiwen Yunfu. Morohashi was like a great gift to sinologists. And that's why, I mean, that's one reason why every sinologist in America and and I think in Europe too, you have to know Japanese or you don't count. If you don't know Japanese, we're not going to give you a hakusei. We're not going to give you a boshi shui. You must know Japanese. Because it's not just Morohashi, it's the whole tradition of Japanese kangaku. Like today, in class, I just had another class before this one, and that's why I was a little bit late coming over here. I talked about 2 topics. Some of my students are here. I talked about Gei, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And I talked about Liu Fa. Liu Fa is the 6 laws. The first, the foundation of Chinese art theory and Chinese art criticism. I guess Xie de Liu Fa. I guess most of you have heard of it. So that's the very, very beginning of Chinese art criticism and art theory. And I wrote a long paper about this, which I worked on for about 30 years, and I showed that people just haven't understood that text. Neither Chinese, nor Americans, nor Europeans, nobody understood that text, including James Cahill, who understood almost everything about Chinese art. Until a man named William Acker came along. I think he was a Dutchman. Or maybe he was an American who lived in Holland. Anyway, see, you probably have heard of Li Dai Ming Hua Ji, right? Li Dai Ming Hua Ji. Well, that was the most important collection of literary art historical texts in Chinese tradition up through the Tang, and then it had huge influence beyond. And so in the Li Dai Ming Hua Ji, there, the Liu Fa is incorporated. So William Acker, who is, he liked to tipple, he liked to drink, but he also got inspiration from his drink, I think. There's so many wild, weird, bad translations of the Liu Fa, crazy translations. So nobody was understanding it. So Zhang Yanyan, who was this important editor of Chinese art historical texts, incorporated the Liu Fa, and he rewrote them radically. This is very strange. The seminal text of Chinese art criticism was rewritten by the seminal editor of Chinese art history texts, Zhang Yanyan, because he couldn't understand it. It was an admission that the text either was garbled or that it had some kind of secret knowledge or that people just didn't know it, couldn't understand how to read it. They couldn't understand, they couldn't parse it. So along comes, really since like 1,500 years, nobody could understand that text. And yet it was the key text of the whole Chinese art historical tradition. So then along comes this guy, William Acker, and he reads it, and it makes sense. And he read it in the old way. The first time it really made sense to anyone. And so I got really excited because I'd been troubled by the fact that for as long as I knew that text, I'd never encountered an intelligent or an intelligible translation of it. So then I started to figure out how and why Acker got it right. And guess what? It's because he followed the old Japanese way of reading it. it said something like, it says number 1, 2, 3, right? And it says, each one of these 6. The first one is something, 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 and that's this. Well, everybody else was so confused by the construction, they just couldn't make sense of it. And Zhang Yuanyuan totally, he said, Zhang Yuanyuan put yi yuan. And then Zhang Yuanyuan got rid of the shi yuan. He just dropped it off. But Acker kept it, and he made sense of it. and the reason he made sense of it is because he followed the old Japanese, a very old Japanese way of reading the text, which was Japanese. The Japanese have a way of reading Chinese text that is very rigorous and almost mechanical in terms of transforming what is kind of like unclear Chinese grammar into very precise and clear Japanese grammar. And so he would say, Acker followed these old Japanese grammarians, these old Japanese scholars, and they said, ichi kori nari. They would say, for the yeah, they would say nari. And it all fell together and made sense. He read it just like a Japanese. And then I went beyond that a little bit, and I figured out all the Sanskrit background that had escaped everyone else. Because if you don't know that the Liu Fa is related to Liu Zhi Shadanga from India, you can't possibly figure it out, because there are some very recondite types of knowledge in that text that are Indian influenced, but they're very, very subtle, and it takes a lot of effort to extract them. So that's where I went beyond Acker. So, I'm being grateful to Morohashi and to the Japanese sinologists who are like our mentors. Like we Western sinologists, there was a time when China was closed off to the world from 1949 until Deng Xiaoping opened up China. It was pretty much closed. And foreigners, scholars couldn't come here to study. But yet they wanted to study. So where'd they go? They went to Japan. So there's the old generation, the old generation who just learned classical Chinese and didn't pay any attention to Japanese or any modern language, or certainly not to Mandarin. Then there comes another generation that sneaks in there just before me. And that's like the people who were going to Japan when China was still closed up. And they all learned Japanese. One of the guys I'm going to talk about soon is Hartwell. His generation they were all learning Japanese. And all the people who were the great scholars of Chan, Zen, they were all going to Japan to learn. And they were good in Japanese, but not good in Putonghua or Guoyu. And so I'm saying we have a debt in that generation of, especially, Japanese scholars who were really devoted to kangaku, not kokugaku, kangaku, and who were really good at it. And it's just like, there was another generation before that generation of Japanese influenced sinologists. People like Cleves, or actually people like Pelliot and Chavan. Guess what language they learned? Manchu. All those old sinologists of the 19th century, late 19th century, they all learned Manchu. Just the way Hartwell and those guys learned Japanese, and the way you all learn Mandarin, Putonghua. Everybody had to learn Manchu. And if you want to ask me why in the question period, I'll be happy to reply. There was a good reason. So then there was another great transformation. Around the same time Sihai and Siyuan were being edited, we start to get the Harvard Yanjing indices, Hafo Yanjing Soi. And this was a fantastic boon to scholars of Chinese. Now, I knew William Hong Ye, who was the chief editor of those indices. In the indices. And he's the guy who didn't want to be called Cha Bo Shi. So he was a phenomenal person. He had been the former, I think the former dean at Yanjing Daxue. And he was responsible for keeping Langdon Warner from stealing all of the Dunhuang wall paintings. And very interesting guy. He was the editor of the Harvard Yanjing Indices, and he went home and told his father, who was a traditional scholar, he told his dad what he was doing, and his dad got very angry. He says, now look, any old person will be able to read the classics now because they won't have to memorize them. So you're doing something very bad. Of course, William Hong was proud of what he did, but his father couldn't understand because his father was from an earlier generation of traditional Chinese scholars who, they didn't need any indices. They memorized texts. I think people like Wang Guowei, they had that kind of mind. And of course, somebody like Wang Guowei was also learning German philosophy, and he applied it to the study of Hong Meng, for example. So there was this a transformation within traditional Chinese scholarship too that involved cross-fertilization with Western learning. And so you get these supreme scholars in China like Wang Guowei who are good in the old way, but they're also learning European approaches as well. Okay, then after we have the Harvard Yanjing indices, we're also getting the French concordances and indices, and then we get the Chinese university ones. So we have practically everything we need now with an index or a concordance, so you can look things up. But even those now have been taotied because everybody's looking things up electronically, and we have databases. Every old Chinese text practically is on a database. So I'm going to talk about Geyi now. This is another paper I wrote recently, but a paper I worked on for 30 years, like the Liuplot paper. I like to work on papers for 30 years, because then they mature. And also, if you wait long enough to write your paper, new technologies will become available, what will help you. And if I had written my Geyi paper, if I had finished my Geyi paper 5 years after I started it, like back in 1972, 73, I wouldn't have been able to achieve what I did when I finished it in like 2004 or something because of all the new technologies. And I'll explain. Hey, I don't know if does everybody in the room know this term? Don't be shy or bashful or ashamed. Who does not know this term? Thank you, Steve, for being honest. Both hands up.
Group of one.
Everybody else knows this term, right? Everybody. Who doesn't know it? Everybody, are you all being honest? Come on. Be like Steve. Do you know it or not? Okay, wait. I'm going to do this again. I'm going to do it two ways. Who knows what this term means? Hold up your hand real high. Like this. Wait, this. Okay. Who does not know what this term means? No, not like this. This. Oh, very different set of answers coming up now. I had to coax it out of you. Come on, if you're in my class, you get no candy. You have to be honest and forthright if you want to take a class with Victor Mair. Otherwise, you get in trouble. This term is very prominent in Buddho-Taoist studies, Buddhism and Taoism. And I'm going to be very fast. Like today in my class, I talked about it for about 40 minutes, and I could talk about it for 2 or 3 hours. But I'm going to try to talk about it in 6 or 7 minutes. Blah, 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 real fast. So, Gei is supposed to mean, a modern scholarship says that it means matching concepts or matching terms. And the whole idea is that this is how Buddhism came to China, sort of like on the coattails of Taoism. That you took a Buddhist term in Sanskrit and you want to translate it into Chinese, you matched it up with a Taoist term. Like, say, Wu with Nirvana. Okay, that's the theory. And it was, everybody believed this in the 20th, from the 50s on, in the 20th century. It's in every 参考书, every 百科全书. It's the standard definition that it is a type of translation that enabled Buddhism to come to China by emulating, matching terms in Taoism. I first heard about this from my teachers. I heard about it from Leon Hurwitz and Edwin Kanzi, especially Hurwitz. These are great scholars of Buddhism. And from the very first time I heard of it, I didn't believe what they were saying. I was skeptical. And then Nagatomi at Harvard tells me all over. And it's in every book about Buddhism. And I just couldn't believe it. Because, in my estimation, when Buddhism came to China, it was a very well-established religion, and Taoism wasn't even a religion. What would there be for Buddhism to emulate or模仿 about Taoism? It wasn't a religion. And then everything I could see about Taoism as a religion, as an organized religion, looked like Buddhism. For example, Sanzang, Sandong. You know, the Taoist canon has the 3 portions. And then you read all of these Taoist texts from the 6 dynasties when Taoism is becoming a religion, and they look very, very Buddhist. Like sometimes 40, 50, 60% of the vocabulary is Buddhist, flat out Buddhist. So I was saying to myself, this can't be. Something's wrong with the definition Gei. So I started to look at it. And that's like 30 years ago. When I first heard it from Nagatomi in 1970, the second heard it in 1972, I really got troubled. And I started to read everything I could about it. And I kept researching it and putting things in big folders. And then finally, by about maybe about the year 2002 or 3, I said, now I'm going to start to write this paper. It's been sitting around too long. So I started to write it. And then along come a group of new graduate students. People like Josh Capitanio, Dan Boucher. These are my graduate students in Buddhism. And Yang Jidong. And they were all very good with computers. And I'm very bad with computers. But I know what computers can do. So I asked my graduate students, I said, please do some searches for me. Search every text in Chinese from the Han Dynasty to the modern period and find Gei. And it turned out that Gei was a phantom. It really didn't exist, except for about a 50-year period in the 3rd century. And I can't go into all the details like I did in my class this afternoon, but I'll try to be as concise as possible, that there was a Chinese monk named Zhu Faya who wanted to cope with numbered lists in Sanskrit text. That's what it was. I can't tell you how I figured this out, but there's a little biography of Zhu Faya in the Gaosong Zhuan. It's just very short. And it said he invented this method of Geyi. He's the guy responsible. And it says exactly what Geyi was meant to do. But the problem is it's hard to read. It's hard to understand. The text is opaque. And if you just read it, Mama hu hu de qu du sha qu, you're going to misunderstand what Gaosong Zhuan is saying. And that's how everybody was misreading the text, his biography. It says it's for coping with numbered lists in Sanskrit text. Now, Chinese did not like numbered lists. The Indians love numbered lists. Like, the Buddha has so many physical appearances. And in this philosophy, there are 38 categories. Okay? That's what Indian philosophy and Indian iconography is all about, these numbered lists. But if you look in old Chinese philosophy, you very seldom will find any list, and certainly not lists over 5. But the Indians are nuts about lists. They just go crazy with giving you lists of all sorts of things, up into the hundreds. So when the Chinese first encountered Buddhism, they were like, we don't know what to do with all these lists. So Zhu Faya tried to invent a method. He failed. It didn't work. And then a very famous Chinese monk named Dao An said, forget it. Scratch. So it only lasted like 40, 50 years. And it had no impact. It was repudiated by the most eminent scholar, Buddhist scholar, Dao An, and nobody talked about it again. But yet, people were saying in modern China and in Japan, people like Tsukamoto Zenryu, they were saying, well, even in the Song Dynasty, or Xuanxue in the Nanbei Chao, Xuanxue, if it weren't for Geyi, these things wouldn't exist. But that is Hu Shuo Ba Dao. It's not true. It is fake. It's false learning to say this kind of thing. There's no such thing as Geyi Buddhism. In Japanese, they say Kakugi Bukkyo, or in Chinese, Geyi Fojiao. No. That's only a figment of modern scholars' imagination. So then just before I was about to publish this paper, I was in Kyoto, and I went to the Jinbun Kagaku Kenkyujo, and I used their magnificent library, and I found an article that I had not come across in 30 years. It was by Chen Yingke, and it was he who started this notion. I think it was late 20s, 29 or 30. My hero, Chen Yingke, had committed the basic misinterpretation of Geyi. And then a Beida professor named Tang Yongtong, I think you all know, a great professor of Buddhism at Beida, he followed Chen Yingke's explanation, and the whole world learned from Tang Yongtong, and everybody, including Nagatomi, and every professor, every scholar was saying that this is what Geyi means, and it doesn't. But, okay, so how could I write this paper? This is what I'm saying about how we do Hanxue now. I could not have written that paper in the definitive way I did. I wrote it's definitive, and already people have stopped talking about Geyi. It's a non-entity. Because of the paper I wrote. I could not have written that paper without electronic databases. Impossible. Because I could read the whole Siku Chenshu in an hour. Ha ha ha, you want to try it? And I could read the whole Buddhist canon in 60 seconds. You want to try it? And I can say there were no instances of Ge in all of these texts. And yet people like Chen Yingke and everybody was saying that Ge was so important. It's fake. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. We can now do these phenomenal things in scholarship because of our technologies. And we're so lucky. I mean, I'm very lucky to have lived to this time because now we have copying machines and we have email. And I didn't have a copying machine. I had to type my dissertation real hard through 5 carbon copies. And if I made a mistake, I couldn't change it. You think how easy it is for you to change your mistakes. Okay, in the future, there will be more things like databases. There will be more sophisticated ways to get at learning. And scholars in the future will be able to make greater advances than we made. We'll be able to do fantastic things. I just hope I can keep living to see as many of them as possible, because I know they're going to be unbelievable. So now I'll close in about 10 minutes. Still have some things to say. I want to pay tribute to a former colleague named Robert Hartwell. Valerie was his student. He was a very strange man. He was hyper-conservative, and he wore bolo ties, and he was like a cowboy. And if you asked to take a portrait of him, he'd put on a pistol and a rifle and glare at you underneath the cowboy hat. But he was a great scholar and a great teacher. The reason I'm talking about Robert Hartwell is because Robert Hartwell had what you could say an inglorious end. A lot of bad things happened to him toward the end of his life. Really bad stuff. And he died too early. But he was a stubborn man and a great scholar. He was a Sung economic historian. And he trained about 6 of America's greatest Sung historians. So this is just to show you the impact of one man through his determination and his, you could even say stubbornness, and his ingenuity, his creativity, how one man can influence generations, because like through Valerie and Robert Hines and Paul Smith and Hugh Clark and all these great scholars that were trained by him, they're training students. You just think of all the people that Valerie's been training. And she's a disciple of Hartwell, and her disciples are his grandchildren. So Hartwell was trained at the University of Chicago, and he got the idea he was going to put into a computer all the biographical information about people in the Sung dynasty that exists. Now you have to remember, when Hartwell did this, we just had tiny little computers. Like your little laptop was probably 10 times, 20 times, 100 times more powerful than Hartwell's computer. I mean, he was working at the beginning of computers, and he was so stubborn. He said, he started out with cards or something, computer cards, which was really old. And then you got into floppy disks. Can you imagine trying to put all the Sung biographical information that exists on floppy disks? You don't even know what they are. You have thumb drives that can hold like 1,000 floppy disks. So Hartwell said, I got to do this. So I don't know if he invented it or he got something called a Bernoulli box. It is very mysterious. A Bernoulli box. And he was very proud of his Bernoulli box. And he plugged it into his computer, and night and day. His wife was named Marianne Carlson, and they worked on this together. They did nothing except input some biographical data. Forever and ever. So it's all in there. And it's fantastic. You could write hundreds of PhD dissertations on the basis of what's in Hartwell's databases. And, there's for one thing that always sticks in my mind, I wanted to look up literacy in the Song Dynasty, and I said, Bob, I said, can you help me look in your database for information about literacy? And he goes, and out comes this something so precious. I want somebody to write a paper, a dissertation about it. An illiterate Buddhist monk that's in his database. I mean, an illiterate Buddhist monk, and what that guy did. And so there's all this great material in there. And, okay, so then Hartwell got in all kinds of trouble near the end of his life. Big trouble. He was on national TV, that kind of big trouble. And he couldn't get along with his colleagues in the history department. He ended up in my department like a refugee. He got kicked out of, or he ran away from the history department. He even tried to run away from the whole of the University of Pennsylvania. So he ended up hating Pennsylvania. And so when he got real sick, he retired and went off to live in a log cabin in, where was it, Wyoming, I think? Out in the mountains. Huh? Montana. Okay, one of those states out there. Montana. So, and then he was on the downhill. He had some bad health problems, and so he was dying. And everybody was so worried about this precious database. What's going to happen to it? And he says, one thing's sure, I'm not giving it to Penn. So he starts looking around where to put the database. And, there's a very energetic professor at Harvard named Peter Bohl. And it ended up at Harvard. So what's fantastic, and why I'm going on about this, because I admire Hartwell so much, is because what's being done with that database now, and it's an example of what I think of as the future of Sinology. And that is, Peter Bohl and his group, and various groups in China, have wedded Hartwell's data to GIS, Geographic Information Systems. So, you go in and you push a button and you see on the map where people were located. And then you have networks, like where were groups of people located? And like people who got married, where were they? Different parts of China. It's a visualization of information that was only verbal before in a written text. It becomes visual in a map. And so you can see the kind of fantastic things that are happening because of some stubborn old guy 30 or 40 years ago who said, I'm going to do something that only I can imagine. And I don't care what everybody else says. Everybody thought he was crazy, but he did it. And we're all benefiting. So now I'm going to have an academic lottery, an academic raffle. I have 2 copies of this book. I thought the author would be here today. I don't see him. This book just came out. It's still hot off the press. It's still warm. I was going to give it to Endymion Wilkinson. And I'll tell you why I was going to give it to him, but then I changed my mind. Because Endymion Wilkinson is sitting back there, and I have to call attention to him too, because as much as I admire Hartwell, I also admire Endymion Wilkinson. I'm not going to say all of his glorious titles because that would probably embarrass him. But he's the man who wrote the manual for the study of Chinese history, the one from Harvard. I don't know. Everybody in this room should have it. It's been through 2 editions. I think it started out yellow and went blue, or was it bluer than yellow? Anyway, the next one, it's almost out, is going to be red. And it's for a reason, because it goes up to Communist China. But if you want to know how to do Hanxue, you want to be an accomplished Hanxue jia, buy his book and master it. Just learn everything in his book. It's like this thick, all done by him, one man. It's mind-boggling. It has to do with money, metrics, calendrics, languages, text, weights and measures, music, medicine, science, anything you can think of about Chinese history. It's in his book, and it's like a guide to how to do research. And it should be your Bible. I'm serious. That's the Bible for a sinologist. And I hope he spent 12 years on this third edition, and it's about to come out. I think 12 years. It's about to come out, and it'll be great to have it. And I hope he writes another one 12 years from now. But I hope he also has an easier life for the next 12 years. Because to write a book like that by yourself must be just so hard. But it's like that stubbornness of people like Hartwell who just, I'm going to do it. And Endymion Wilkinson said, right there he is, sitting in the back of the room. You should all go meet him. He said, I'm going to do it. And he did it, 3 editions. So that's like where Sinology is now. You go read his book. And I was going to give this book to him in gratitude. This book is called, it's by a guy named Yi Hua. It's Yi Hua Xian Hou Shuo. Yi Xia Xian Hou Shuo. So the Eastern barbarians in the Xia, a theory on their precedence, like which came first and which came later, in their relationship. And the author's name is Yi Hua. He is a researcher at 中国社会科学院的民族与人类学研究所. I can only say it in Chinese. I wouldn't be able to say it in English. So Yi Hua, very good scholar, a young scholar. And the reason I'm going to have a raffle for this book. I was going to give it to Endymion, but then I thought, maybe somebody else wants it. But so, if you want this book, what I have to tell you what this book is about. It's about the evolution of Chinese civilization in the Bronze Age. And why I'm saying this, presenting this to you in a lecture on Sinology is because this is like the new wave of Sinology in China. This is what I think the best kind of Sinology is emerging within China, because I think Sinology do you all hear me apart from the microphone? Okay. I think Sinology in the future must be multidisciplinary. But you can't just be a philologist. You also have to be like a scientist. So you need to be an anthropologist. This book, it's anthropology, it's metallurgy, it's agricultural studies, it's archaeology. It uses all this kind of material to come up with a convincing answer of the relationship between Yi and Xia, and how China emerged from that interaction between the two. I think it's a work of genius. It's a really wonderful book. And he's still not well known in China, but he will be. So the title in English, you can get an example. It says, A Perspective on Yi and Xia, China in the Bronze Age World System. Oh, do I love that. Because world system, that's another thing I want to say about Sinology now and in the future, is that you can't just view China as Zhongguo, the central kingdom. You can no longer just think of China as isolated behind a great wall. China has been interconnected with the world since the very beginning. I mean, I won't say anything in detail right now, because if you get me started on this, you'll be here until like 9:30 tonight. But here's a young Chinese scholar who's using traditional Chinese learning, Western learning, combining them multidisciplinary So, we're going to have a raffle. Anybody who wants this book, and it's a great book, Zhang Xing will hand around a ticket. And you put it, you remember your number, and so she'll pull up to do it. Huh?
I mean, you can also keep.
Yeah, so what you do, you write your name on one, put it in the box, and keep the receipt.
You can also choose it.
Yeah, or you don't have to write your name because you just rely on it. Okay, so all you do is just like, if you want the book, right? I only want people to take this if they really want the book. I don't want you to just put this in the HOT somewhere. Huh? Yeah, okay, you pull it off and put it in the box. And don't take one unless you really want to read it. You hear me? Okay. So this is, I think, is a great new wave of Chinese, new kind of Chinese Sinology. Just brand new. So you can, well, I'm going to present it. Okay. Tear off one, don't tear off more than one. No cheating, only one. I mean, you cheated first when you wouldn't admit Bak Ge. Almost done. So I said just now that I think the future of Sinology has to be multidisciplinary. And then beyond that, I would like to encourage you to write things collaboratively, because nobody now is able to command all these various fields except Endymion. You have to be able to spread across so many fields it's virtually impossible to, and even within one field you can barely keep up with the literature. So don't be embarrassed or bashful. We humanists are always just like stuck in their cubby holes, in their studies, their offices, and they just work by themselves, and they don't work very much with other people. But I would encourage you to write things collaboratively. I think the last 3 or 4 of my books have all been written jointly with other people. And I've written a couple genetics papers, and there can be like 20 authors on a genetics paper, and everybody works together and contributes something. So this happens very much in the sciences, and I hope that in Sinology, which should grow toward being a rigorous science, that you won't be afraid to collaborate with others and write papers together with people. So that's all I want to say, and I'm happy to entertain questions. I hope I don't leave you speechless. Valerie?
So, up until the raffle, I was wondering about, and the definition you started with of Sinology as something for foreigners to do. And what's the relationship, the simple question is, what's the relationship of translation and Sinology? And another way of putting that is, do Chinese people really do Sinology?
Great question. Being both a sinologist and a translator, I say that they are different things. Because to be a good translator, and there's a guy named Brendan O'Kane sitting right behind you, who's a very good translator. A young man from Temple, but hanging around Beijing too long. Anyway, he's a great translator. And you don't have to be a sinologist to be a translator. It helps. But the most important thing about being a good translator is to know English well. I'm not kidding you. I mean, most Americans, English is their native tongue. They don't know English well enough. So they can't write good translations. I'm not kidding you. That's why my brother Dennis is also a great translator, because his English is so darn good. It's not because his Chinese is darn good. It is. But more importantly, it's because your own mother tongue is good. So if you want to be a good translator from English into Chinese, your Chinese better be darn good. And I have to say, the reason my English is good is because I was an English major. 我的本科是英国文学，不是中国文学。And I'm very glad about that, because now when I translate, I can write felicitously and make things sound nice. And a lot of times, like Ezra Pound, I mentioned him earlier. What was the earlier context? Achilles Pound. Yeah. So Ezra Pound, he approached Chinese through Fenollosa, the guy from Boston Museum. And Fenollosa learned his Chinese in Japan. And that's why it's not Li Bo or Li Bai, it's Rihaku. Okay? And Hakuku-yi, not Bo-ju-yi or Bai-ju-yi. So that's how Ezra Pound learned his Chinese through Achilles. And Achilles was in close connection with Fenollosa. And Ezra also knew Fenollosa and knew his work. Okay, so you read any translation by Ezra Pound of a Chinese poem. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. And often he catches the exact essence of a Chinese poem. But guess what? He wasn't a good sinologist. No. He was not a sinologist, but he's a fantastic translator. So that answers your first question. Right? Okay. Now your second question, which is, repeat it.
Do Chinese people do sinology?
Oh yeah, do Chinese people do sinology? Well, according to Hanyu Da Cidian, they cannot do sinology. Because sinology is for 外国人. And Hanyu Da Cidian is very authoritative. So, all of these bases here, they must be for 外国人. Well, this is very interesting, because maybe Hanshui now is becoming something that Chinese can do. Maybe there now are, like Yihua, people who can do sinology, but it's not the same as 传统中国文史学. And then he will know something about this.
Well, I simply wanted to ask a question.
Oh, wait a minute. You have to speak very loudly, because I have...
I wanted to ask a question.
Another question.
Yes.
Okay, I may have to...
Following on from Valerie's question.
What?
Following from Valerie's question.
Oh, okay. I have bad ears, so I have to come near it. I can hear...
Following from Valerie's question, which is a very perceptive one, can you think of anybody in my country, in England, who would do Englandology?
Englandology.
It doesn't make much sense. Can you think of anybody in America doing Americanology? I guess they would study the Indian tribes, the ethnic people. So sinology, it seemed to me you described very well, was at a time, it started at a time when there were no dictionaries, there were no tools of the trade, so they had to do philology. But now, as you've also described so well, we have databases and so on. Sinology is dead. It's finished. We have historians of China, and we have historians of China in China. We have historians of China in foreign countries. There's no distinction. We're all gathered together with the same purpose. You can have an Egyptologist, because ancient Egypt is dead. But China is still alive and very much connected with its past. And therefore, why separate the two things, modern China from ancient China, and have sinology for ancient China and whatever you have, China watches for modern China? So sinology, in my view, Victor, with due respect, is dead. Thank you.
Oh, did you hear the radical stuff he was saying? 汉学死掉了，现在不存在。But what am I then?
应该是不地。
Anyway, it was a very eloquent statement and provocative. Sinology is dead. But then it's not so dead. because, well, wait a minute. This is very interesting. I didn't talk about this. It says 汉学家 in Chinese, but here it says China Studies, which fits. Okay, it's still alive for the foreigners. Wait a minute, this is for the foreigners. China Studies. It fits with what you said. But this is like 保古董在这里，汉学家已经死掉了。But it's in the Chinese. Now wait a minute, do we have Sinology anywhere here? Not one of them used the word Sinology, right, in English? Wait a minute. No, Chinese classics. So nobody, the Chinese, when they wrote this English, they were very careful to avoid the word hanxue, Sinology. So you can see it's in a state of flux. Whether or not Sinology is alive or dead or dying, one thing we know for sure, it's transforming. It's not the same as it was for Paleo or Stanislas Julien. It's not the same as it was for Hartwell. It's different. But see, that's why I think probably Endymion wouldn't call himself a sinologist, or he wouldn't call his book a sinological handbook. It's a book for the study of Chinese history. Yeah. And in that sense, sinology may be like no longer relevant, except I'm a guy who is straddling philology and the new Chinese studies and is trying to be relevant before I die. I'm still alive. So in a sense, in me, hanxue is still alive. Because I'm stubborn and I want to keep staying a sinologist. I'm stubborn. Okay, 还有什么问题? One more way. One last My old friend. Hey, I want to say something to appreciate him. There are two people in this room, Wang Wei and Rong Xinjiang. They are both very, I'll let you speak in a moment. I'm going to speak first. Okay. They are both very eminent professors here at Beida. And tremendous accomplishments, both of them. He's in Indian studies and he's in medieval, like Tang studies, Rome. Okay, so both of these guys, who has that book? Hold up the Wei Hua. Yeah, you 表演. Hold it up. No, the other one. There. So they were involved in the translation of that book into Chinese. How long? 20, 25 years ago? 20 years?
Yeah, 20, more than 20 years.
And they did a beautiful
1980s.
translation. At the request of the famous Ji Shenlin, his name is on the front of that book. So anyway, I want to thank them for, when they were very young, for translating that book. Okay, now you say your piece.
Thank you for your good word. Another question about I discussed the meaning of the Gei. You mentioned you're talking about simply or literally, if we understand it, is some Gei means try to understand or try to do research on the meaning of the words. As you mentioned from Zhu Faya and I agree with you. The meaning of these words or the influence of these words was exaggerated by a Japanese scholar and then followed by some other scholars. But it's quite simple. Just for example, as a way of philology study, you try to understand the words, and the Gei is just during that time the people want to explore some way to deal with the translation. And for example, you start your speech today with the introduce of those titles of the five titles of the Chinese GD or some 研究院. To me, it looks something you are doing some Gei with this. The transport, how to translate it, or the meaning, if it is exactly compatible to the Chinese translation. And you say the Han Xuejia, you cannot find the Han Xuejia's word in the what is that? The first, some title at first I know the Chinese title. Some of them I never saw it. The English title of the Peking University International Academy for China Studies.
These are official English titles.
Oh, and
official.
Chinese learning or the national, National Institute. We Chinese people, we like some big words.
Fancy words.
National Institute means it is the most prominent institute or supported government, or institute supported kind of government, or institute or national institute. Only, for example, the library, we say national library means the library by Xiao, that is the national library. But here, whenever with the Beijing Weibo Daxue, there's another national institute out there. Exactly the same name of the 汉学海外汉学研究所，叫什么名字吧？汉学研究中心。The college some people call the 海外汉学或国际汉学 international theology. So that always we are doing that. We are doing something new.
You can say that. I'm not going to respond. All I will say is that at least they didn't use the word Oriental.
Yeah.
That would have been a big can of worms. No Oriental. Oriental is like really, really dead. And I agree with that because I lived through a department changing its name from Department of Oriental Studies and then having a war and having its name changed to Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and then having another war, really wars, academic wars, and then my department was occupied by radical students who said, no Oriental studies. And they didn't know a single word of any Oriental language. 他们怎么改? And we believe, 我们教授研究中国、埃及、叙利亚，我们相信 ex oriente lux, from the Orient comes light. We think the Orient is something great. And yet these students were trying to tell us Orient is demeaning. And there was an Oriental noodle factory down in Chinatown. Oriental noodle factory. Why are the Chinese calling their own things Oriental? Well, anyway, there's no Oriental left. It's dead because of Edward Said. Anything else? 还有问题吗? No, you did your GAI. Okay. Jim, next, but you have a question. Please, you speak very loudly, please.
I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to the audience. I'm a graduate student. I'm a graduate student of College of Language and Literature. I'm a graduate student of College of Language and Literature of Beijing Normal University. So I come here to hear your speech, and I want to ask a detailed question about what's your opinion on the necessity of giving a definition? Because when you talk about 配文韵符, you said it's a chip, and it's not very good at giving definitions.
It doesn't have any definition.
Yeah.
So what's my opinion about what?
Yeah. So. And also when we talk about the translation and communication among different people, we always say it's important to give an exact definition. But I'm wondering if it's helpful to give a definition to understand the Chinese concept. We know give definition to 人, and also 庄子 and Dao and the Lao Tzu, they are the Taoists. They are totally against.
They're what?
Against giving definition. Yeah. So, I mean, if it's a helpful, and will it be hurtful or have some negative effects when we learn Chinese traditional culture, or when we try to understand the traditional Chinese culture? Is it very important, or what's your opinion on the importance of giving a definition?
Okay.
Since you have...
I'll answer it this way. Please read between the lines. First of all, I translated both the Laozi and the Zhuangzi, and I love the Zhuangzi. And I think I communicated with Zhuangzi when I translated his text, and I conveyed to the American English reader what Zhuangzi is all about, the spirit. And I want to say this, that if you get hung up on definitions, you're not going to be a good translator. Because you have to understand a whole sentence, a whole text, a whole paragraph. If you're just translating word by word, see, this is one of the worst things about translating Chinese, especially classical Chinese. You just say one word by one word by one word. You're going to have garbage, gibberish. It's terrible. And I will just tell you, I see Brendan nodding his head. So I will just tell you, I taught at Donghai University for a couple of years. And I had a student, I called him a living dictionary. He memorized the whole English dictionary. He really did. He memorized the entire English dictionary. He could recite all the definitions in an English dictionary. But he couldn't write in a single intelligible English sentence. And he got D's in my class. And he memorized every definition. So that's my answer. Okay? Maybe one more question. Or if you have no more questions, no more questions. And if you can, a few of you maybe come up to see me individually, or you can even send me an email. If you have some lingering question later on, you can send me an email. And I'll try to answer it, although I'm usually weeks behind in my email. Anyway, it's been a great pleasure to come here, and I enjoyed talking to you.
Victor, what about the wrapper?
Oh, the wrap? Where is it? Oh, I get to pull it. I hope that Endemian gets it. Oh. Number 17. Who is 17? Oh! I will come and make a formal presentation. You're welcome. Oh, she's from his same institute. Oh. And the book is brand new. I got one before she did. Okay, that's great.